the suggestion that I should be a presenter in this series, and congratulations on this series, was made last October at our dining room table in Johnstown with Donnie Calabrese and Mark Delaney. They were working on a creative project about Dr. Moses Cody, and I waxed on about my first-hand contact with Cody and about my experience with the Antigonish movement. No doubt they saw some evidence of passion, I'm sure they saw a lot, that might be suitably exposed in this creative forum. I hope they read correctly. Donnie extracted commitment. During the intervening months, I went blithely along, not knowing what, if anything, I could speak about. And with a push from Nicole not long ago, I peeled away to the core of what motivates me and identified the significance of experience as the source of my remarks here. I'm interested in the place of experience as the author or generator of progress. It's really about learning from experience. Tonight I will keep my eyes fixed on Cape Breton, although making continuous connections between what we know and what we do is a formula with universal application, if we only knew how to make the connections. I'll present some examples of where experience was employed or not employed as a route to progress, social, economic, cultural. I'll draw on observations from my early years, but mainly since 1960. See, I mean, those were late years, 1960, when I came to work in Sydney with the Extension Department of St. FX University. I'll explain how, in using the notion of experience, and mention a few instances, how I'm using the notion of experience, and mention a few instances where experience played a part in progress. I will mention ingredients that foster or prevent building on experience and conclude with a glance at the liberating force of experience, all within more or less 18 minutes. Learning from experience. Learning by doing and from doing is a very old idea, as old as Aristotle. I was in my late 20s when it first caught my attention in a philosophy course that was an overview of philosophies that have influenced the ages. That was pretty late on my part. I suppose my cultural, my religious, and my educational background account for that tardiness. But in the philosophy course, the otherwise dull but clearly ingenious professor taught each class as though he was a follower of the respective philosopher. As he moved through the semester, he conducted class as though he espoused the way of knowing represented by each philosophy, and it was quite intriguing. I was totally transfixed, however, when he came to John Dewey's philosophy of education. I had no background in formal education in the sense of studying education. He turned the teaching-learning process on its head. He began with the learner's interest. He enabled us to move our thinking from the perspective of our individual situations to look at what's possible. I had never been before treated as the subject of what had to be learned. For me, up until then, the material to be learned was the subject. I, the learner, was the object. I was the container to be made wise by being filled with knowledge. As subject, the learner is the center of attention, in a productive way, I think. The learning process begins with one's interest in relation to the proposed topic or issue. It is an active process. It leads to practice on the part of the learner, who has to do something with what is being learned, even if that something is only trying to make various cognitive connections. They have to deal with being challenged by conflicts and contradictions, to find connections, to bring divergencies together. It is a totally active process on the part of the learner, and it builds on knowledge as it builds on experience. Learning to make connections with previous knowledge and experience establishes a habit of critical thinking, a habit of seeking new solutions. All good stuff. Now, I distinguish between experiential learning and learning from experience. The first is a deliberate process where what is to be learned is assisted by building on the learner's experience. For example, using experience as a way to grasp a concept such as atmospheric pressure because you're really interested in weather. Just making those connections. The second is learning from experience as a habit of viewing a new situation as somehow connected to the previous experience you had. Both apply when it comes to making progress as an individual and as a society. Throughout these remarks, I will attend to the idea of learning from experience. Now, I'm learning from experience. Look. Tonight I will pay attention to the experience of the citizen or of the group, the community, when the objective is to achieve social, economic, or cultural progress. What we call progress, of course, is a very slippery thing. However, I measure progress in terms of having the people concerned build on their experience, gain new knowledge, new skill, come to new decisions, and continue to develop, to move on, to a very large extent, to move on their own. It's about human development, about learning, about behaving differently. It's about the way we deal with change. It places people at the center of attention. 3 broad categories, and that's where those 3 words come in, help to identify places where experience relates to progress. And I just use them as hooks, really. The source, that is the need to change. The context, that is for fostering new behavior. And the outcome of any action that might have been taken. And I'm going to move now to an example of the Antigonish movement. It was a strong influence for change in many Cape Breton communities, especially during the middle years of the 1900s. I was fortunate to be around to witness some of the benefits of this notion of education for economic cooperation. Credit unions were entirely local, managed mainly by volunteers, as were consumer cooperatives, which were a way to gain independence from another kind of credit system granted by local merchants. Then there was the cooperative marketing, whether it had to do with fishery, with agricultural products, or even home products, as a way to increase financial return and production control for primary producers. And housing cooperatives were a way to own affordable and good quality houses. The trade union movement in Cape Breton was also helped along by education programs of the Extension Department of St. FX University. Taken together, the organizations were truly dynamic, sometimes weakened by poor business practices, of course, but on the whole, significant vehicles for social and economic development. The source of the idea for this cooperative and collaborative work was essentially external. A blueprint for action was brought to local communities from the university, mainly through what was called study groups. Yes, there was need locally, but it was not a matter of local people getting together and saying, what will we do about this problem? They were helped to see the extent of an issue affecting them, to understand that if they used this vehicle, whether it was the co-op or the credit union or I'm looking at Helen McDonald down there, she just knows all about this, a consumer producer co-op, a credit union, etc., it would overcome the problem. Okay, they were told they had a problem, they knew they had a problem, they were helped to understand the problem, and they were helped to see the vehicle that they could use to get around it. They formed boards of directors, they ran a system of savings and loans, they built stations for bringing produce together to be shipped to an outside market. They met for months on end to plan the way they would build a co-op housing group. Yes, they had a need, but it is unlikely that there would have been much such uniform and relatively strong response if they had not been given the blueprint and the push from the university. I happen to believe that, and I could talk about that for quite a long time. The context was a social and economic condition that some members felt with sufficient strength to take the blueprint and make it work. The role of prior experience was quite limited in the sense that there were few skills related to business management or to building a social movement. But there were some important contributing skills associated with their day-to-day lives as fishermen, mothers, miners, teachers, truck drivers, homemakers. The nature of the job to be done stimulated interest and enabled learning new behaviors. It was something they needed. something that they gradually came to see they could do, to work together, to challenge legislation and regulations, to plan for long-term results. As for the outcome of their actions, progress can certainly be claimed for the short term at least, and I'm saying 30 or 40 years. In the main, their organizations did what was intended at the time. But progress was minimal if measured in terms of people using their new experience. Knowledge and skills to continuously address change over the long term. I'm not very credible saying this without presenting community by community evidence. As a general claim, however, if they continue to develop, they would have been the policymakers and the owners as conditions changed in the fishery, in housing legislation, in the mines, in the steel industry. Those organizations shared a similar structural base, although with different purposes. Working together across their, and I'm going to just generally put a label of cooperative organizations, they might have understood the challenge as circumstances changed in those industries and become part of plans to act. Taken together, there was quite a population of people with that background. They might have built on their organizational experience and added their weight to the job of advancing Cape Breton society. They didn't. The important question is why? Why were these organizations with so much in common not the designers of blueprints for actions to deal with changing social and economic circumstances? Is it because they were not the designers of the original blueprint of the organizations that worked for them? I don't think that's the reason. As years went on, why did development initiatives, and we've had many dollars worth of them, not pay sufficient attention to the experience of those people? Time to move. I'll take other example, government development initiatives. Since 1967, when the Cape Breton development legislation was enacted, we have seen literally hundreds of development initiatives that deserve analysis, are getting analysis to some extent, and can only be mentioned here in a very, very sweeping way. In the main, the source of the ideas for change was external, through defined programs accompanied by budgets. Sometimes there were efforts to build on the experience of people, sometimes. For example, that wonderful program where some miners transformed their existing skills to a new work situation at Fortress Louisburg. That was a lovely little example. And small-scale business ventures developed in fishing, agriculture, and tourism. Good things happened. Not the least was the gradual building of a high-end craft development enterprise that is this Cape Breton Center for Craft and Design. Look back at each of these relatively small-scale initiatives, and you will see how they progressed, or failed to. My hypothesis is that when the people who had the most to gain were given the opportunity to build their own plans, to understand what success could mean, and to learn how to move in that direction, when they were helped to walk before they could run, those were the ventures that progressed, slowly and sometimes painfully. That is the richest context for progress. And the outcome, when it works, is a situation where people are able to build on their experience, to anticipate change, and to find ways to realize that change. And if Carol Beaton were here, she would tell you about those steps. Very often they are flying on their own with no assurance that they can get the resources for the next move. It might not be the sort of success they wanted, but it is a dynamic situation where success engenders success. Now, I'd be hiding under a blanket if I didn't look at the places where the really big bucks were spent, primarily in steel and coal. With the close of these industries, we have relatively little to show today in terms of contribution to human and social development, in the sense that they enabled people to anticipate change, to find ways to make the change, and to work at it. Obviously, while those industries lasted, they provided well-paid employment. We were happy to have them. We were sad when they left. They were not really development initiatives, however, in the sense of building a comprehensive economy among people who would join that effort. Perhaps they ought not to be judged on whether people learn by being engaged in issues affecting those industries, to use their experience to strengthen Cape Breton economy and society. Perhaps not. In terms of learning through experience, I think it was an enormous opportunity lost. So, what alternative? How might it have been otherwise? Returning to the three analysis points, the source of the various ideas to keep coal and steel viable was external to the main, and it was external certainly to the main workforce in those industries. Their objective was to continue to be employed. Unlike the Antigonish movement, whose idea also came from outside the community, there was no effort to have the steel and coal communities participate in a learning process that would connect them with these industries. From my little experience in both, the steel and coal industries were built on an us and them foundation. Essentially, it was impenetrable, a century-old foundation. It didn't matter that the respective enterprises were owned by the people of Canada or of Nova Scotia. There appeared no evidence that as citizens, the workforce and management shared the same stake in the enterprise. As citizens, we were all stakeholders. One could dream that although these were crown corporations, the context might have been arranged whereby the issues each industry faced were shared in a way to challenge employees or even the community to determine what is possible. So all could at least understand what they were up against at any given time. You know, when we know what we're up against, we're more likely to act. At the very least, an alternative might have been to deliberately engage all who worked in those two industries to gain problem-solving experience in the workplace and problem-solving experience they could carry into their community. The habit of finding new, even small-scale solutions would benefit the individual and the overall economy. Said bluntly, and in terms of societal progress, the outcome of these industries, in those terms, was extremely disappointing. As mentioned, and I'm going to go on with this us and them barrier, as mentioned, the job of learning from experience is to make connections between what we know and what we do. Despite what I've said about the major, long-established industries not leading to progress, their legacy of experience is still worth contemplating. If nothing else, we can learn from, thank you very much. I don't speak very much lately to big groups of people. Or as passionately. Where was I? It means understanding how the us and them culture blocked progress in the past. Beyond merely saying it happened, we should know whether it is still happening, and if it is, build ways to eliminate the blocks. I think I have another us and them here. Yeah. A small example of the us and them, that's capital US and capital THEM, block, happened when we were working to gain biosphere reserve status for the Bedore Lake and its watershed, and you heard from Jim Folds here one night. It cost us about a year in the 6-year process to overcome opposition from the mining industry that had the ear of two levels of government, provincial and municipal, warning them, the governments, that a biosphere reserve would limit future chances of developing their industry. Despite meetings and many letters exchanged, we did not succeed in reducing mistrust on the part of them with their important their mistrust for us, with their important economic potential. They saw us as irresponsible environmentalists. They counted on the us and them divide. Exhausting all means to bridge it, we proceeded without their support. We knew that while mining operations work within regulatory limits, and if they do, a biosphere designation would not threaten mining development. Oh, I'm still on the us and them. It's very hard to ignore capital them. I've felt the conflict often and I left them unchallenged. And that's for sure. Why? Because they had power through funding resources, through political clout and other forms of influence that could block what us were trying to achieve. I'll cite an example. As vice chair of Enterprise Cape Breton, that was a precursor to an ECBC, I worked with a small committee that began a project to organize sector groups. I don't know if there's anyone in this room who was good enough to come to some of our meetings. Agriculture, fishery, forestry, and so on, with a view to having them draw up their own development agenda, prepare proposals, and gain funding for projects they deemed important. Like all development efforts where you work from the ground up, it's very slow going. Funds were not in short supply, if anyone was around when Sinclair Stevens was. We had money. But time was in short supply. Long before long, I was told by a powerful person to quit that effort. He argued, we only have a short time at the trough, and the trough was his word, and you are not spending the money quickly enough. This sad example illustrates, and the whole thing stopped. The sad example illustrates the need to continuously demonstrate the contribution of human development to progress. If that person understood how this could build, then you wouldn't perhaps have that problem. You might run out of money in 2 years with another election or something. By enabling people to build on their experience, strength can be built to proceed without them. Or better, in concert with them. It takes vision, selflessness, patience, and a lot of time. From humble beginnings. A segment of Cape Breton society that I've watched from a distance, and it's from a distance, is the music and entertainment business. When Tom Kent was president of the Cape Breton Development Corporation, he died this year, but he was here and he was a pretty powerful guy. We used to call his little ventures in industrial development, but he also had many big ventures. We called them the bunnock and molasses industries. Usually he was the source. He was the source in the sense of being the initiator of the ideas. Many of them worked. In particular, his development of tourist facilities that we're still using. Music enterprises made up one area he assisted, and many have assisted since, but for which he was not the source. Gradually, and maybe grudgingly at times, with the assistance of a sound system here or payment for a venue there, advertising expenses somewhere else, support was given to enable musicians to gain strength. And they soldiered on, as you know. Men of the Deeps became an icon. Many, many others who I'm sure will say they could have used much more support, nevertheless received a hand up toward national and international stature while assisting Cape Breton to become an icon in itself when it comes to distinctive musical successes, not least being the opportunity afforded by Celtic colours. These and other relatively small-scale beginnings, New Dawn among them, and I must confess, Rankin, that I'm not up on New Dawn, but I've always known about it. It's there. Added to the earlier examples of the center, the example I mentioned of the Center for Craft and Design, these illustrate the potential for positive development when, regardless of the source, the context fosters growth. To conclude, given all I've said, what in the end am I claiming to be the place of experience as a generator of progress? I presented a few examples where there was ground for long-term development by building on what the population knew and could do to reach new objectives. Activities associated with the Antigonish held greatest promise. Some programs, small-scale ones, supported in part by government, gave both inspiration and necessary means to move local initiative and talent along. This organization I keep pointing to. It didn't matter much where the source of the idea originated. What mattered most was the context for fostering new behavior. If it was one where people were encouraged to build on what they knew and what they could do, then there was room for creativity and innovation. The examples of steel and coal gave no deliberate attention to forming a habit of critical thinking and seeking new solutions. As for attention to outcome, we tend to point to failure in a conclusive way. We just say, oh yeah, that didn't work, without reflecting on the parts that worked and on how those that didn't might have been handled differently next time. There are exceptions. The Center for Craft and Design is one of them, where they are being very deliberate, using this 40th anniversary to celebrate their success. While I do not know New Dawn very well, as I said, I'm sure that organization has much for all of us to learn about building on failure and celebrating success. The significant point in all of this is to be able to shift from being the object of change to being the subject, to deliberately build a learning society with the citizen at the center of attention. The major questions facing Cape Breton development become something to move our thinking from the perspective of our individual situations to study what is possible. Maybe that's what this is about, you know? I was thinking as I sat here tonight, I lost my spot, to study what is possible anyway. For example, some may be moved by the sorry state of our woodlands as an economic and aesthetic resource. Some by the extent of population depletion. Some by the need to break the us and them block, and so on. In a learning society, leaders attend to making sure these interests are supported by a context that fosters new ideas. I'm looking straight at a guy who just declared he's going to run for mayor. and new behaviors leading to change. A learning context, learning to make connections with previous knowledge and experience establishes a habit of critical thinking, a habit of seeking new solutions. Building on experience is a liberating force. It builds competence, confidence, creativity, innovation, and productivity. It puts us in charge of our own house, a house where everyone is us. Thank you.